We often used, have any of you ever heard of Ken Wilber? He's kind of an organizational psychologist, I guess. And we usually used his integral model to explain or to kind of schematize what we meant by formation. And as you can see here, he's got this quadrant which is divided up into interior and exterior on the top, and then into individual and collective on the bottom. And individual and interior, we've got that realm of personal meaning. You know, it's kind of what goes on totally within me as I think about my own life, my own search, my own meaning, and so forth. But there is also an exterior dimension to that. Unless you're a sociopath, there is some connection between personal meaning and individual behavior. You know, that you kind of do what you are, in a sense. That people, you know, if you interview somebody for a job, you're looking for a connection between motivation and exterior behavior. You know, is this person going to do what they say they're going to do? It's kind of it's the exterior demonstrable part. Then there's also the interior collective part, which pertains to the group rather than to the individual. And there we've got organizational culture and shared values. So if you have a group of people who share a personal meaning or a set of personal values, that's going to create a certain kind of organizational culture and shared values. I don't know if any of you saw it, but several years ago there was an article in the Chicago Tribune about a new management team that took over at the Chicago Tribune, or maybe the article was in the New York Times, but it was a description of the radical change that took place in that organization when these outsiders came in, a new CEO, new management team. I mean, they kind of made a wreckage out of the Tribune Corporation, but it was a stark example of how different organizational culture and shared values made a very different kind of organization in a short period of time. It was really shocking. Look it up sometime, you'll be able to find it. But then the exterior dimension here, you know, you've got your collective, which is kind of the group values internal to the organization. Just as personal meaning translates to individual behavior, organizational culture translates to business systems and processes. That's why we talk about different corporate cultures. You know, sometimes mergers fail because it's just two different shoes that don't fit, you know, two different cultures. When we look at formation, we're really talking about the left side of this diagram. We're talking both about individual personal meaning and values, and we're talking about organizational culture. So formation is primarily geared to individuals, but if it's valid, it's going to have some clear effects on the organizational culture as well. And so we would kind of use this to argue that if a healthcare system has good formation for leaders, senior executives, middle managers, eventually that's going to create a kind of organizational culture and shared values, which then will lead to this. I would frequently run into groups in Catholic healthcare who their idea of mission was mainly nostalgia for the days when, you know, well, when the sisters were here, well, if we just had more sisters on the board. Oh, I remember we had a sister CEO. That's great. They did a wonderful, wonderful thing, but that kind of nostalgia is not going to hold us very long into the future. You know, if it's going to happen again or continue to happen, it's going to depend on the ability of today's leaders, from the board on down, to develop this and ultimately to develop this. And I don't underestimate, you know, that it's a big challenge. We're talking about a huge organization, and I don't think, I mean, I'm sure there has never been a time in the church's history when we have had such a rapid transition in leadership of such a huge organization in such a short period of time. You know, basically 30 years. If you look at the numbers of religious women who were CEOs 25 years ago and the number today, like 25 years ago, 75% of the CEOs of Catholic hospitals were sisters. Today, probably 5% are. You know, the numbers have just flipped. Almost every CEO is today a layman or woman. All of those centuries of culture and history in developing these systems suddenly has radically and quickly been turned over to somebody else. You know, can we meet the challenge? Steve.
I agree completely with this, and I agree with your assessment. And you can create that personal meaning and organizational culture in a one hospital system, which most of these religious orders founded, and then they grew out. Even then, they took the sisters and moved them over to another site and grew into a two hospital system. Now that, and when working at Ascension or Trinity or any of the other large systems, and you've got 80 hospitals that to deal with, how do you make that happen? And do you fear that as we get bigger and bigger to compete with the for-profit systems, that's going to dwindle away even further than what it is today?
Well, you know, 10 years ago, I used to say that we had 10 years to fix this or to address this problem. And maybe we got another 5, I don't know. Yeah, you know, it's a huge, I think the jury's out on it yet. I don't know if we can do this or not. I think we can. I mean, I'm pretty optimistic about the Spirit's presence in these ministries and the ability to marshal the spiritual awareness of a lot of people to do it. But I don't think we know whether ultimately this is going to work. I forgot where I was. You had a question?
Yeah, but I don't know where I'm headed either, so I'm not sure. So 10 years ago, probably, I was working for Bon Score at the time, and we brought in John Allen to talk about PJPs. And one of the things that he said is the bishops don't trust the PJP because they don't trust the formation process.
What are PJPs?
I'm sorry, public juridic person. So moving from the sisters owning it, so to speak, to being sponsored by a board outside of a vowed religious community. That wasn't a bad description off the top of my head. I don't know what a PJP is.
I have a clue what a PJP is. So.
Now fast forward 10, 15 years, and Anthony
Tassini.
Thank you. From Ascension's just been appointed to a job that I don't entirely understand, or not to a job, but to a role within the Vatican. And it was described as with a focus on the spiritual formation of our employees within Catholic healthcare. Just if you look back, and I guess it's a follow-up question, if you look back on those 10 or 15 years, what's your sense of how we've done embodying leadership at the governance level?
It varies widely from one system to another. You know I'm prejudiced because I worked for Ascension, but I really felt that they were committed and understood what was going to be necessary in the future to make this happen. Like when I was there, we had one bad year fiscally, and they made everybody cut their budget at the system office by 10% except the formation program. Now to me, that said a lot, and I was always looking to see, well, you know, are they just talking about this or do they really believe it? But I came to think that the senior leadership really did believe it and were ready to put their money where their mouth was. In terms of the boards, you know, I've worked with systems all the way from the size of Ascension to small systems that have 4 or 5 hospitals. I'd say 80% of them don't get it. They maybe understand that there's a need for ethics, but when you get beyond that, it gets pretty fuzzy. You know, there was a debate for a while about whether the best way to go about this was to start with the grassroots, you know, which many people would say, oh, you start with the grassroots and you build up. I don't think that works. In my experience, you got to get the board on board, as it were, the board and the leadership, because if they don't buy into it, sure as hell nobody else is gonna. So if you can really get the board to understand what this means and enable them to feel comfortable talking about this kind of stuff. Like, you know, if you've been to board meetings, you know what it's like when you go in for a 3-hour board meeting and the agenda is stacked up that deep, everybody's in a hurry, they want to get back to their jobs, it's either 7 a.m. or 9 p.m. at night, you know. Getting them just to take 5 minutes of silence. Now think about that. It may sound like a simple thing, but this is not easily done. But if you can do that, you begin to open the door for them to think about their work as a board in a different way. It's not just going there and getting a bunch of tasks done. It is going there as a group and being willing to sit several minutes in silence, reflecting on a reading or listening to music, and then inviting a little bit of reflection from the group. Typically, the first time they won't do it. The second and third time, one or two will. And then they begin to develop the ability to talk about some of this personal stuff, about vocation, spiritual meaning. When you do that, at least in my limited experience, then you begin to really make a change. I remember one time when I was doing a board retreat, we had a session, a business session, then we did a formation thing. We took about 45 minutes and included silence. We happened to have a harpist there who was playing music, and we had reflection on scripture. So then everybody went home and came back for dinner later, and the board chair came in and he says, well, I went home and I walked in the door and my wife says, what's the matter? And he says, what do you mean, what's the matter? And she said, well, it's the first time you ever came back from a board meeting and didn't slam the door. So I thought, well, maybe something happened here. Yes?
I actually just, I spent 3 weeks in Philly. I worked within the Mercy Health System. I'm present as a Jesuit priest by Bioethics. And one of the hospitals that they had taken over was originally Jewish. And now it's being run by the Mercy Health System, which is a Catholic health system. So I was actually very intrigued by it. I mean, how did this way, a Jewish hospital becoming, and some of the workers there, some of the physicians and the nurses were still Jewish. They still had a significant Jewish population in terms of the patients that they see. But what struck me was that I think they went in with a focus on what was common to both of them. It's not about we being Catholic and we coming to, because if you really look at the big issues, the major difference, for instance, maybe brain death, if you have a very Orthodox Jew, won't go by that. But most other things were like that. So there was space for discussion. I attended one ethics committee meeting. There was reflection. Not everybody there was Catholic. There was actually somebody else who was, I think, a rabbi, and then another thing. And it was, I actually found it very spiritual. So I left Philadelphia thinking that, you know what, the things that we fight about really are really non-essential, because if you look at the faith community, this was not even between Catholic and Protestant, but this is Catholic and Jewish, very significant. But I saw it work in action. Yes, Mercy is just 4 hospitals, so maybe it's easier now. They are actually acquiring a 5th hospital in Baltimore, which originally wasn't Catholic. But you go in with your vision and your mission. This is what we are. Sometimes the challenges is due to the parish, because the Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia had come out with a statement that every patient with PVS must be fed. I mean, non-negotiable. You know, so that was something that they were trying to tease out, and how do we negotiate it. But oftentimes there were more things that kept them together as a health system than divided them, even with the various ones. Then I went to Holy Redeemer. And there, part of their chapel, actually, the Jews also, what did they do, the Shabbat? Well, the Jews also used the Catholic chapel for their service. And I was like, really? I mean, it really blew my mind, because Proudens have thought that Judaism and this, they would have their own synagogues. So within the healthcare system, you see a lot of room, or I saw a lot of room for collaboration, definitely between, these are 2 health systems. Holy Redeemer is different from Mercy, but in the same way you saw the Jewish patients coming to a Catholic hospital and finding space and voice. They were not being proselytized, they were not being shut out, but even within that system, they found space. And I really admire that kind of what I saw in Philadelphia. I don't know whether that's what happens here in Chicago or the bigger system, but with these 2 systems in Philly, it really spoke to me about focusing on the bigger issues, the deeper issues, being spiritual, being connected, rather than the little things that separate us.
Yeah, that's an excellent example. I think you're really describing a situation in which both groups were able to draw on this spiritual awareness. Almost every board I worked with had Jewish members on it, of this Catholic healthcare system. And I have to say that they were usually the first ones who understood what we were trying to do. Sometimes somebody would be a little nervous about it, but usually you know, Judaism has a deep spiritual awareness, obviously, and I think they have something analogous to what we would describe as sacramental awareness, you know, that created things mediate God's presence to us. So, but you can invite people in, you don't have to give up your Catholic identity, but you can explain it and you can hold it as something that you treasure and invite people to understand it and to integrate it or collaborate with their own faith tradition. And I think what you're describing is exactly what we would try to do. Sometimes it's just too complicated. You know, there's a system in, I think it was in, is it Kentucky 1, which was a Jewish hospital, a public hospital, and a Catholic hospital. Is anybody?
Academic center.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That's a stretch. Now, maybe they can do it, but not everything is possible. But, you know, when you look at Catholic values, especially Catholic social teaching, I mean, we're not talking snake handling here. I mean, these are deeply human values, which you don't have to be a Christian to understand, you know, the basics of Catholic social teaching. Steve?
Charlie, I'm also fascinated by personal meaning and individual behavior, getting back to your original concept of the religious order, the sister who basically grew up in the hospital, lived in the hospital, took a vow of poverty, worked 7 days a week, and was really an example that created the organizational culture and commitment. And now you've got people, lay people like myself coming in who are, there's no difference between myself and a for-profit CEO who now, you know, drive in luxury sedans and live in a lifestyle that's radically different than Sister Sheila. So that's the example, the lived out example. How does that translate into organizational culture? So when you're working with the frontline staff and you're asking them to make sacrifices, and then me as the executive, I'm not making any sacrifice, you create this really contentious dynamic. So are you seeing that in the work that you're doing?
Yes, I have seen some executives. I remember once with a group like this, they were all vice presidents and CEOs, and we were having a discussion, something along this line, and about Catholic social teaching and the common good. And they went off into small groups and came back, and I was asking them, well, what came up in your group? And one CEO said, in front of a group of CEOs, he said, if this stuff about the common good is true, we are all making too much money. Now, I thought for him to volunteer that in front of a group of peers was a pretty dramatic thing. And I think that there are a lot of executives who are asking those kinds of questions. Can we really witness to all this? I mean, how much money you've got really doesn't matter in the end. It has to do with other things. But yeah, I did see some very edifying examples of a breakthrough.
Negotiating with potential senior executives, the argument goes you have to pay in order to recruit top quality. And back to your comment about board members, well, you know, are you willing to make the sacrifice and the commitment to create something different? And if you're not, we're going to shake hands and move on.
Right.
At what point do boards and executive teams get together to say, we are different. I am different than a tenant healthcare.
Right.
And I'm going to make that personal commitment to work in this organization.
And
the
I'll settle
sacrifice
for
that
$2
comes
million a
with-
year.
Yeah, exactly. That's a rough idea.
No, that's right. The organization has to ask that. One system that I know actually developed the Theology of Compensation, in which they raise very delicate issues about what it means to be in a mission-driven organization committed to the poor. Now, that doesn't mean everybody reverted to $30,000 a year, but it did mean that they were willing to ask the question.
You know, one of the things that occurs to me is it's something I struggle. I teach junior year nursing students. And one of the things I struggle with the students is getting them to match their beliefs, if you will, or what they say are their beliefs with their practices. I don't think X, Y, and Z should be permitted, but if it was my family or if it was me, and there's this disconnect. What this does is it says we are whole people.
Right.
And that we have to be whole people in the totality of the different stages where we find ourselves.
Exactly. And that's exactly why he calls it the integral model, that it means there's an integration that's necessary for human.
Yeah. I mean, why did I leave a $100,000 a year IT job? Because my personal meaning was being conflicted in my individual behavior in the mortgage industry, you know? And that was what was important to me. What I realized was not what was important to the organization I was working for. So, you know, career shift, education shift.
And it's a kind of conversion where you have a moment where you see
Absolutely.
clearly what your vocation is.
Yeah, and that's not to say it's not, I mean, how many here have had that experience of leaving one particular vocation or job and finding yourself in something totally different because you feel called and drawn to something with a hopefully deeper purpose for that common good.
Right, right. Okay, I think there's two more points I want to make quickly. One of them is that you can talk about an individual vocation, which is the kind that most of us are really familiar with, you know, if we think about our own purpose in life. But I think those of us in leadership of ministries have to also think about institutional vocations. In other words, here at this hospital, for example, we're inheriting a vocation from the Jesuits who established this university and this medical school. And there's something that's being handed over to us that really is bigger than any of us. And as leaders, as board members, as executives, we are caretakers of that institutional vocation. As you can see here, as this guy talks about it, he says that the consequences of this gift of institutional vocation are evident in a corporate sense of identity and a unifying loyalty to a set of purposes. You know, that's what we're trying to achieve here. It's not just a bunch of independent contractors coming together for mutual benefit. We're also coming together for the sake of this vocation, of this ministry. And I think to reflect on that is an important thing for boards, for example. You know, what are you holding in trust here? Is it just a balance sheet, or is there something more than that? The last thing is another way of thinking about this formation question is that in formation, we're both trying to create a culture and to hand it on. And culture is something that's both distinctive and worth preserving and inheritable, which is the reason these Catholic healthcare systems are here today, because the original insight of the founder was inheritable. It was able to be passed on to another generation. And that's the challenge we face today. Are we going to be able to hand on this charism of Catholic healthcare to another generation? You all are right in the middle of it. And as I said, I'm not sure we can pull this off. I think we can. But it isn't going to happen accidentally. It's going to have to be the result of deliberate activity. And this is out of a book which I could share the title of with you, but I can't remember it offhand. I think it might be by Patricia Whitberg, maybe. Does that name ring a bell for anyone? Anyway, she talks about this culture thing in religious communities. But she says that culture must be distinguishable and inheritable. And we can clearly see the problems with distinguishability if we only try to be the best health system possible so that we look just like whoever we think is the best, but has no reference to religious identity. Inheritability is obviously what we're trying to do through formation programs. Can we take this distinctiveness and sell it, in a sense, to those who are preparing for leadership, for those who we hire, for the board members that we invite? Can they own this? Can they understand it? Can they feel it? Maybe is a more important question. It isn't just a question of memorizing the bylaws, but of having a feeling about this distinctive culture that you can appropriate and then inherit from the generation before you. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. We can have a little more discussion. These were just some of the elements that I used in formation. We did seminars which involved input like this, as well as reflection. We used spiritual practices, silence being one of them. Lectio Divina, which is simply a slow, reflective, meditative reading of Scripture with silence and inviting people to listen to it and then to say something. You know, you usually read it through twice. let it really sink in, and then invite the group to address it. That was pretty effective because it wasn't, we could use Hebrew scripture, Christian scripture. I used the Quran one time, and really invite people into a deep reflective hearing of this sacred word and say, what does this mean to you as leaders in this ministry of healthcare? We did retreats, which included more prayer, more reflection, more kind of structured things. The flashcards that I mentioned earlier to you. Case studies that related to board agenda items. This was a little bit trickier because I would go from one hospital to another, so I sometimes lost continuity with the board agenda. But if I could build a formation session around something that was actually on the agenda and get them to unpack what that meant, in terms of some kind of spiritual value. Again, it was not something that boards were accustomed to doing. They're used to looking at these things financially, operationally, competitively. They were not used to thinking about business decisions spiritually. But it's part of a process of teaching them to do that and not to be embarrassed about it. I mean, it's okay for us as board members or executives to think about this serious strategic decision spiritually. That's okay. We can do that. It's not going to make you soft. We can handle this. And then these were the topics that we developed, and we used versions of this in all the formation programs because we were trying to create a consistent curriculum that went all across the system and different levels of leadership. So we made some variations here depending on what group we were dealing with. But this was generally what we did. And I learned through this process, I think the heart of this formation process was really Catholic social teaching. And the more I did it, the more I focused on that. Because if you look at the common good, justice, subsidiarity, solidarity, if you can get leaders to understand and really buy into those things, boy, you've got a big chunk of what Catholic culture is about. So more and more I saw that as kind of the core of this whole thing. And I said it wasn't just exploring them as academic ideas, but really looking at, for instance, justice as a state, a social and political state of being, but also as a virtue. That's really where the personal connection was. Is there justice out there? Okay. Am I a just person? Well, that's another question. And you can do that with all of those key things because they're all virtues as well as kind of goals of politics and social life. So I really began to see that as a key part of this. And I think ultimately what formation is about is forming virtue. You're trying to get people to become virtuous leaders. Virtue being, an acquired moral ability to do the right thing for the right reason. If you can do that, you got pretty good run on an ethical organization, and we hope a spiritual one.